Before we create more components, we can organize the ones we have right now. First of all, we have this Hello World component that we don't use anywhere, so we can go ahead and delete it. Usually, components are part of other components or are responsible for small tasks, though this is not the case for the page components. So, even though keeping all components within the components directory is totally fine, as soon as they are named properly, I prefer to have the page components in their own root directory. I have seen a lot of people calling this directory pages, views, or something similar. Whatever name you pick is fine as soon as you and your colleagues can spot it without a second thought. I prefer pages because it is easy to understand what it includes. So I will create the pages directory and I will move the page thread show, page home, and page not found within. Notice that we don't need to make any changes in our components. Do you know why? Because we used absolute paths in our import statements. If you wonder what is the @ symbol in the beginning of the path, it is an alias that resolves the src directory. This alias is defined within the Webpack configuration and it is set up for us when using the Vue CLI. So, no matter where we move the components, they will always look into the src directory to find the data file and the other components. If you use relative paths, like /thread_list, then here you will need to update the path to point to your new structure. One could argue that we don't need the page prefix in our page components, as they now live in our pages directory, and it's very easy to distinguish them. That is true. And also, we only use them inside the router file, and not within the HTML directly, so we should be safe with HTML native element conflicts even if we used a single word to name them. Feel free to stick to using it if you like. There is nothing wrong either way. I will go ahead and remove the prefix. Notice that when I rename the components, I have the search for references option checked. This will update other files that import this component, so it won't require me to make any additional changes in the code. I will show you what this means in a minute. For me, it is important that I can quickly navigate to a component in my editor by remembering or guessing a part of its name. For example, if I want to open the page thread component, I want to be able to type page thread and find it. If I wanted to open the thread list component, then I would type comp thread and again find it and blindly hit enter to open it. As the name of the folder is called pages, my quick find method works both if we have the prefix in the component name or not. Let's take a look in the browser to make sure that our app still works fine. And it does, and that's great. Since we renamed the components, I would also like to rename the variable names in the router file. See here how the import statements have been updated. This was done by my editor when I did the rename with search for references checked. Renaming the local variables is a small detail, but I like to keep the code base tidy. So I will do that. I will rename this variable home. And here you can preview where this change will take place. This is because instead of just changing the word here, I'm using the refactor feature from WebStore. You can find the feature under the refactor option and then rename, but I usually use Shift F6 to do it quickly. Refactor, do refactor, and the same for page not found, Shift F6, refactor, and that's good to go. Before we go into the next lesson, let's also delete the Vue logo from our app Vue template. Now our app looks more pro in the browser, and we also have a more organized folder structure. In the previous lesson, we organized our component directories. We can continue with shaping up our application by making the page thread show component lighter. The template currently displays the thread title and a list of the thread's posts. I think it makes sense to extract this part to another component. I believe post list would be a good name for such component. I will type it here to design the API of how I would like to use it. One idea for our post list component is to accept the ID of the thread, and then it will be responsible for finding the posts in our data source and displaying them. That would be perfectly fine. But I prefer to keep my child components more stupid, to say, so they don't have to do a lot of work. This way, it will be easier for us to debug or change our logic in the future if we need to. Thus, we can instead give the array of posts to the post list component directly. And then the post list will only be responsible for displaying the given posts. This way, we might also be able to reuse this component if needed to display a list of posts that are not related to a single thread. For example, we could use such component in the user profile page later on to display the posts a user has created. Maybe here it's a good idea to call the local data we give to the component thread posts, so it's clear which posts these are. Okay, this looks nice, so I will stick to this API. Before we move on and create this component, I want to prepare this thread posts array as we don't have it yet. Because we need to find this data and we don't have them statically available anywhere, it makes sense to use a computed property. Here we want to return an array with all the posts that belong to this thread only. There are many ways to do that. I will look into the root posts object and use the filter function to grab the posts whose thread ID property is equal to the ID of the current thread. That should be perfect. Let's confirm that it works in the browser. Here I have found the component in our component tree, and you can see that we have this thread post computed property. It is an array that it includes 4 objects. These are the post objects that we will pass to our post list component. Notice here that it says anonymous component. If you want to give it a name so you can see it when debugging, you can do that by using the name property in your component. So here you could say name thread show. Then in your dev tools you can find your component using the name. Let's go ahead and create the post list component. Since this is not a page component, we will put it under the components directory. I will move the div with a class of post list from page thread show to the new post list components template. We have decided that this component will receive the array with a post to display. So let's add this prop. Posts should be required and type of array. And now let's update the template accordingly. In our v4, we now want to iterate and grab each post from the posts array. For the key, we can use the post ID. Inside the iteration, we use the post by ID helper method that we don't need anymore, as we have access to the post object directly. So we can replace this part with a post. Next, we use the user by ID method. Let's grab that method from the thread show component. We also need access to the source of truth for the users that currently is our source data file. So I will copy these parts from thread show too. That should be good. Let's go back to thread show and use our new post list. To do that, we just have to import and register the component. Before we test it in the browser, let's remove the code that we don't need anymore. we don't need to define the user's data. And we also don't need the method that finds a single user or a single post. We now do that inside our post list component. So that looks good. Let's check it out in the browser. Everything seems to work fine, and we don't have any errors in the console. That's great. Now our ThreadShow components template is super clean and acts like a guide for this page. You and other developers can understand what it does by spending 5 seconds reading the template. We could go a step further and break down the post list to use a post list item component, so we simplify this template and script too. Feel free to do that if you like. I will stick to rendering the posts inside the post list component for now. Now that we have our list with the posts, we should let the users participate in the discussions by creating new posts. To begin with, we would need a form to write some text. Where should we put this form in our code? Well, we could place it within the post list component. But I prefer to have the code that interacts with the global state in the parent component, which in this case is a thread show. In Vue.js, we use the word state to describe all the data around our application. Each component has its own private state that it is actually its data. In our case, the data.json file is the global state, since it is being shared among all components. So I will add a form right after the post list here. In the form, we will need the text area and the submit button. I will paste some HTML markup for that here to make it look nicer. You can just keep the form with the 2 required elements. I will also put this code in the description of the lesson so you can copy it if you want to. To make the form work, we can bind the text area's value to a data property and invoke a method when the form is submitted. So let's add a new data property that I will call newPostText. Now I will bind it to the value of the text area. This way, the text area will have the value of newPostText, but the newPostText data will never update. What we want to do here is to update newPostText every time the user types something in the text area. The first thing that comes in mind is to listen to the input event and store the value to the newPostText data property. Whenever we need to listen to a native or custom event, we use the von directive. Von needs the name of the event to listen to. In this case, we want to listen to the input event. Next, von accepts an expression that can be a method or an inline statement. Since what we want to do here is quite simple, I will use an inline statement, where I will set newPostText to event target value. I will switch von with its shorthand, which is the @ symbol. Now, if newPostText changes, the text area's value will update. But this time, if text area's value changes, newPostText will change as well. This is what we call two-way data binding. Let's check it out in the browser. I will find the ThreadShow component in the components tree in Vue DevTools. Now, I will type something in the text area to see that the value of newPostText data property updates. Great! Now, to show you the two-way data binding, I will change newPostText to something else in the DevTools. So I will make this hello there. Notice that once I hit save, we immediately see the value of the text area update as well. Perfect. To make our lives easier, Vue provides the vmodel directive that is syntactic sugar for vbind value something on input update something. So the vmodel directive creates a two-way binding between the input element and the data property that is bound to. So we don't need this anymore. Okay, let's create a method that will store the post. I will call it addPost. Within addPost, we have to create a post object and then push it to the posts array of the data.json file. To do that, first let's check how a post is structured. Each post has a published add property, a thread ID, a text, and a user ID. Remember that the thread ID and the user ID properties are foreign keys that connect the post with the related resources. So, our post object should contain the text, which is the value of the text area, so this dot new post text. A published at attribute, which is the current time. Published at should be a timestamp in seconds since January 1st, 1970. To get the current timestamp, we can use date.now, but this returns the timestamp in milliseconds. In order to convert it in seconds, we can divide it by 1000 and then round the result using math.floor, which returns the largest integer that is less or equal to the given number. Next, the post needs a thread ID, which is the ID of the thread that owns the post. Since we are in the page thread show component, we can easily access the thread ID using this .id. And lastly, it needs the user ID, which is the ID of the active user. Since we haven't implemented authentication yet, we can use the ID of a random user for now. Let's pick one from the users object. Since we don't need to redeclare the post variable later on, we can use the const keyword here to declare it. Keep in mind that we can change the post's properties, like post text, but we cannot reassign a value to the post itself. Okay, I think it looks good. Now we have to append the new post to the posts object. We can use the posts object by mapping it to a data property or directly using source_data.posts. The thing here is that the new post does not have an ID. Later on, we will use Firebase to generate IDs for all resources. For now, I will use a string along with a random number. In general, you should not be responsible for creating IDs manually, and even if you do, you should use a library instead of relying on math_random. With the ID in place, I can add the post to our post list. Before we test the form, we also need to add the post ID to the thread.posts property, because we use thread.posts to find the posts we display in the thread page. To do so, we can access the thread using this.thread and then push the new post ID to the posts object. To connect the addPost method to our form, we can listen to the form's submit event and then trigger the method. Thus, we will use von. In this case, we can write von_submit equals addPost. Let's check it out in the browser. Hello there. Submit and nothing happens. This is because the page reloads right after I hit the submit button. So we need to prevent the browser from reloading. Vue.js offers a .prevent event modifier, which is the same as using e.prevent defaults within our code. I will apply the prevent event modifier to our submit event listener and try again. When I hit submit, it still doesn't work. Let's see if the post is added to the posts array in our data. I see that we have 77 posts here, so let's try to add it again. I click submit a couple of times, but the array length doesn't seem to change. Let's see why this might be. So I notice that we have one post here, but if I navigate to the post list and back to thread show, our array has 98 entries, so it means that it adds a post every time I click the button. This means that our code works fine in adding the post, but our changes in the component and in the browser are not reactive. The reason that this is happening is because Vue.js doesn't get the change when we do it to the JSON file directly. But we do have a local data property called posts that maps to the source data prop. So if we use these posts instead of the source data directly, then this change should be reactive. Let's try that. Now, once I submit the post, we immediately get the new post in the browser. Isn't that awesome? It bugs me though that the input doesn't clear itself after the post is submitted. I will fix that by setting our new post text data to an empty string after the post is pushed to the source data. This is a common thing you will find yourself doing when working with forms in front-end applications. Back in the browser now, our input gets cleared after its submission. Great! Having the form in the thread show component might be acceptable in a small application. But if you place everything in one file, it can get messy quickly and hard to maintain as the application grows. So we'll extract the form to a component that will be responsible for creating posts. I will name it Post Editor. Another benefit in having a dedicated component is that we will be able to reuse it later when we are about to edit a post. Let's move the form to Post Editor's template. We will need to define the new post text property and the add post method. I will copy them from the thread show. Now we need to take a decision. Do we want the post editor to append the new post to source data directly, or should we let the parent component be responsible for that? Both ways are fine, but as I have mentioned in previous lessons, I like to keep the logic that alters the state in the parent component, and keep the smaller components very simple. It feels more tidy to keep the methods that interact with the store in one place. When the update logic is placed in the parent component, we need a way to inform the parent component that a new post is ready when the form is submitted. We have learned that we can pass data down to a child component using props, but when we need to communicate back to the parent, we will use Vue's custom events. Custom events work like the native browser events, similar to the ones we use to listen and take action when our form was submitted. Except that with custom events, we can define the name ourselves. The custom event broadcasts to anyone listening that something has happened. We say that we emit an event. To emit a custom event, we use this $emit. The first argument of $emit is the name of the event, and the rest of the arguments are the data or the payload you would like to send to the event listener. In our case, we can emit a save post event and pass the new post to the listener. You can also pass as many arguments as you like to the event listener. For instance, you could pass an author, a thread, a user, and so on. Another thing you can do is to wrap all these arguments in an object, which is what I prefer to do. In our case, we want to pass just the post. A benefit of passing an object is that you don't need to remember the argument order, because you will access the arguments based on the object key. For instance, event_data.post will always be the post. I will comment the code related to altering the source data object. Let's import and register the post editor component in thread show. Now I will render it where we had the form before. Let's see what happens when we create a new post now. I will first give some room to the view DevTools and switch to the timeline view. Here I will highlight the component events tab. And now I will create a post. Notice that we can track events for the mouse movements and for the keyboard while I type something in the input. Now, when I click Submit Post, you can see we get a new bubble in the component events. If you click this bubble, you can see that this event is the save post that is emitted by the post editor, and it carries along the new post we have prepared. We can also change to the All tab here, and now every time I click Submit Post, we can see a new event popping up here carrying the new payload. Of course, nothing happens in the view since we have not created a listener for this event. To listen to the save post event, I will use the von directive along with the event name. So here, that will be onSavePost equals the name of the method. I will use the addPost method and I will make the necessary changes. To begin with, I will just log the arguments in the console. Let's try it again. Now we get some feedback when we create a new post. What I notice here is that the thread ID is undefined. That makes sense since post editor is not aware of the thread that will inherit the post. To fix it, we can either do something like post thread ID equals this ID within page thread show, or pass the thread ID to post editor using props. Both ways are fine. I will create a new object post in page thread show that will have all the properties of the past event data post and also the thread ID. Here I also want to update this line to get the post ID from the post object. I will move the console log here and try again. Now the thread ID is right, since it is the same with the one I see in the browser URL. I want to make some changes to post editor. First of all, we should remove the thread ID line. Then I want to rename the addPost method to save. Then the attribute newPostText can become something shorter, since it's pretty straightforward what it represents. So it can become postText or even just text. I also prefer shorter event names, so I will change our custom event name to save. We should also update the event listener. When you rename a custom event, don't forget to update the listeners as well. Okay, I'm quite satisfied with what we have so far. Let's review our code. In Post Editor, when the form is submitted, we call the save method. The save method defines an ID for the post, and this is something that we have here temporarily. Then it creates a new post object, and it emits an event save with a payload object that includes a post and resets the text value to nothing. In page thread show, we listen for the save event, and when it happens, we call the addPost method. addPost accepts the event data, and it creates a new object called post that takes all the properties from the post editor and breaks them down using the spread operator, and also adds a new property thread ID that is equal to the active thread. Then it accesses the post object, that it is the root store, and pushes the newly created post. After that, it goes to the thread post property and pushes the new ID of our new post. Then we have a console log, which I will remove now. And here we have this old code that resets the new post text that I will also remove. We should also remove this property from our data. Okay, that should work perfectly. Let's give it a final shot. Boom! Perfect! Up until now, we display the date a post was created as a timestamp. Timestamps are great for storing and managing dates, but they may hurt your eyes when you see them on a website. To make the dates human-friendly, we can use a utility library. There are many JavaScript libraries nowadays that help us present dates to our users. We decided to use Date.js in the masterclass because it is very lightweight. In fact, it is only 2 kilobytes, which is great for performance. Date.js is an alternative to the popular library called Moment, that was used in the past by hundreds of thousands of projects. And as they say in the docs, if you use Moment.js, you already know how to use Date.js. To install Date.js, we can run yarn add Date.js or npm install Date.js. The trick how Date.js is so minimal is that it only has the essential features in the core library, and we have to specifically add the additional features we need. We can find all the features in the guide. Here you can see the core library, and in the plugin section you can browse several interesting features. There are many ways to display a date in a format that it's easy to read by the users. I personally like the relative time, where we say, for example, 2 minutes ago or 2 months ago. To display dates in this format, we will use the relative time plugin. To use this plugin, we have to import it from this path and tell Date.js to use it using the extend function. Then we will use this function called fromNow. Let's set this up inside our post list component for now, where we will use the Date.js for the first time. If you are familiar with Vue.js 2, you might be used to using filters for transforming data in the template. However, in Vue 3, filters have been removed, so the implementation is actually more straightforward. What we want to do in the template is to use a helper, let's say diff for humans, and pass it the timestamp as the argument. Do you know how we can implement that? We can use a method. So I will create the diff for humans method that will accept a timestamp. In here, we have to create a new Date.js instance. Our timestamps are stored in seconds, which is the known Unix format. So we should use the Unix method to create this instance. Then we can use the function from the relative time plugin we found that is called fromNow. Great! And since our method does not change the past argument, we should return the value so it shows up in the template. Let's check it out in the browser. Well, it doesn't work. That is because we should not have the parentheses in Date.js before using the Unix method. Let's test it again. Now it works nicely. Also, we don't get any errors in the console, which is great. So here you can now see that this post was made 8 months ago, the same as the next posts. This is great. Have you seen in some websites that they show relative time, like this? And if you are curious of when exactly that happened, you can hover over the text and see the full date. This doesn't happen in our case, but I am a big fan of this feature, so let's make it. A simple way to display something when users hover over an element is using the title native HTML attribute. For example, if we have title equals hello, when users hover over the date, they will see a message hello. To implement our feature, we will need to display a dynamic value based on the timestamp the post was published. So we want to bind the title attribute to something. We don't have a method for that yet, but let's say we will call it human-friendly-date, and it should accept an argument with a timestamp. This looks good. Let's create this method. Let's take a look on the Date.js guide to see how we can format the date. Under the format category, we have all the options we can mix and match to create the desired format of our preference. We can decide how we want to show the year, the month, the day, and so on, and put together a string that will present our date. On top of that, Date.js also provides localized date formats. These formats will format the date based on the active locale. So, if you have a multilingual or multi-locale application, using this plugin, you can automatically display the times in your user's locale. I want to use this plugin and the long format that looks very user-friendly. So, I will first import and add the plugin to Date.js using extend. Then I will use a format function and give it the code of the localized format I chose. That should be good. Let's check it out in the browser. I will give it a refresh to clean up the console first. Now let's hover over a date. Awesome! We can see now that this post was made on Monday, July 6th, 2020 at this time. If we hover over another date, we can see that even though this is also done 8 months ago, it was done at a different time. I think this is awesome. The dates inside the post list look neat. It would be nice to be able to reuse this functionality around our application wherever we need to display a date. At the moment, we could use this feature to present the dates within the thread list in the home page. Right now, we are displaying the thread published at as a timestamp. In order to not repeat what we did in the previous lesson, we should export the functionality related to the date into a dedicated component. What would be an appropriate name for this component? The first thing I can think of is date.view. Though this is not safe, since component names must contain at least 2 words to not collide with native HTML tags. Additionally, if you were to import the DateView component into a variable named date, you would have a conflict with the global JavaScript date object. So, something like forum date or date present would be acceptable, but the Vue.js style guide gives us a great recommendation. Base components that apply app-specific styling and conventions should all begin with a specific prefix, such as base, app, or v. According to this rule, anything among base date, update, and vdate is the best practice. I prefer base date or update. Thus, I will go with update, and since the editor lists the components alphabetically, we will have all the application-based components listed in the beginning of the components directory. Okay then, let's do this. I will first copy the HTML from the post list component to updates template. Within the template, we don't want the post-specific class, postDate, and actually, I don't think we should style the date here at all. This way, any component that uses update will be able to style it based on its needs. So I will remove both classes and I will switch div to span. Then, instead of using the post.published@add property in this component, we will have a generic timestamp variable that should be passed from the parent component that is using update. Thus, our component needs to be passed a timestamp prop to know what time to render. The timestamp prop should be required and a number. Ideally, we would want the timestamp to be an integer, but in JavaScript, you do not have specific types for numbers, like integers or floats. So, we need to use a general type, which is number. Okay, now we need the methods that transform the timestamp to human-friendly dates. I will move them over from post list. The update component needs to import date.js and the needed plugins in order to use all these features. So we will move this here too. Great. Let's review this component. Since we have the timestamp in a prop here, our methods should not need to accept an argument. So we should remove this. Instead, we should transform the this.timestamp, which is our prop. We also do not need to pass the timestamp to the methods when we call them in the template. This looks good. Let's use it within post list. I will import the component and then register it in the components option. Now, let's update the template. The timestamp we want to present here is the post.published@. Let's check it out in the browser. And it works great like before, but this time we have a dedicated component that includes all this logic. So let's go on and use it in thread list. In the template, we need to replace the thread published at with update timestamp thread published at. Switch back to the browser, and in the homepage, we now get the dates presented nicely. We also have our cool feature when we hover over a date. Isn't this awesome? We also display a date in the activity in the right side of the thread list items. Even though we have not fixed this feature yet, it's nice to display the date instead of the timestamp. With our base component, that's super quick to do. Here we go. Now, all our dates are displayed in a nice format, and when we hover over them, we get to see the exact times. By extracting the logic in a base component, we are now able to beautify any date in our application without repeating any of our code. We have created the update component that we know we will use in a lot of places. By now, we have to import it and define it in the components option within the component we want to use it, like in the post list. Since update is a base component, it makes sense to register it globally and then use its tag directly wherever we need to. To register a component globally, Vue provides a method which is the app.component. We can use this method in our main.js file right after we create the app and before we mount it to the DOM. Let's import our update component and register it globally. The component function accepts two arguments. The first argument is the name of the component we want to register. In this case, this is update. The second argument is the component object, that is the one that we just imported. Now, this component is globally available in our application, which means that we don't need to import it and register it in the components we use it. So we can remove the import statement from post list and thread list, as well as the component from the components object. Let's see if that still works. And it does. This is great. But since we have decided that our base components will have the app prefix, we could set it up so all our base components are automatically registered globally. I will show you a secret recipe on how you can do that. I will head over to the View Style guide and navigate to the base component names rule. If you expand this, you can find this code block in the end. What this code does is to look for all the files in a directory that start with a prefix and then automatically register them globally using the old viewComponent method. This code is based on Vue 2, but nothing stops us from updating it and using it in our Vue 3 application. So I will copy it over to our main.js file. First, I will try to fix the ESLint issues automatically. And I will replace var with const. I see this is red, and that's because we are assigning it a new value, so I will use let here. That should be fine. Let's continue with the refactor. In the first line, this code looks in the folder src that's supposed to be in a nested level directory. In our case, we're already in the src directory, so we can either do that or tell it specifically to look in the components directory. Here you can notice the word base, that it's a prefix, and in our case we have decided to use a prefix app, so I will change to that. So this first line, it will look in the components directory here, and we'll find all the components that start with the prefix app. Cool. Then it will do the magic to load the files, and lastly, it will register the components using view.component. Notice how the syntax is the same. It needs a base component name and a base component config, which is exactly the same as the component function that we use here. So I will use our forum app variable inside this loop, which will go through all the app components and register them globally. This means that I can remove this line from here. We also don't need to import the update component because this now happens automatically inside this code. So now we should be able to use the update component everywhere without writing a single line of code. Let's check it out in the browser. It still works here and no errors, which is great news. Now, if we create a new app component, let's say app something, then we should be able to use it everywhere without writing any code to register it. Let's try to use app something in thread list. And here we can see the template coming from app something. You can see that this component does not have any code that imports or registers this component. It has automatically been registered by our magic code that we have inside main.js. Awesome! We have achieved a nice presentation for our threads and posts. Let's go a step further and implement forums. This is the forum page from our mockups. Forums are collections of threads. So a forum called pets will contain threads about pets. The design mockups also contain subforums, like dogs and cats. To avoid adding extra complexity to the business logic, let's not implement subforums initially. To get the ball rolling with forums, let's create the forum page that will render a single forum. Since this is a page, I will create a component under the pages directory and I will give it a name of forum. Forum show could also be a suitable name, but I know that we are not going to have more forum-related pages, so I will stick to forum. With the component in place, I will create a new route for it. The path will be /forum/id. I will give it a name of forum, and the component will be forum. Remember that in order to set the route parameters as a component prop, we have to set the props option to true. Let's import the component and we are good to go. I will open our mockup again to grab the HTML code for the forum page. I will place that inside our forums template. It looks dirty at the first glance, but it will be fine once we clean it up. You might notice that this element with the class of thread list is actually our thread list component. So we can replace this div with a thread list tag. And let's also delete the pagination that will later be part of the thread list component. Now, this row displays the subforums, which we don't need now, so I will delete it. Next, I will delete the breadcrumbs from the top. We also need to remove the div with the class of container since it is being rendered in the app component. It looks great already. Let's work on the component options. Firstly, we need to define the components we are about to use. We know that we need the thread list component, and here, as you can see, WebStorm has imported this for me when I use the tag in the template. All I need to do is to add some spaces around the object so it passes by my ESLint. Next, we should define the ID property which is coming from the route. The ID should be required and should be a string. Once we have the ID, we need to find the corresponding forum. So I will create a computed property forum and then import source data on top. We can find the forum by searching in sourcedata.forums. Then we need to find the threads that belong to this specific forum. I will add a new computed property, threads. Here, to find forums threads, we have to filter sourcedata.threads. Using the JavaScript filter method, we can filter the threads whose forum ID is equal to the component's ID property. Now we can pass the threads to the thread list component as a prop. Let's see what we get in the browser. I will open this forum that I have opened when I tested this link. You can find all the forum IDs in our data.json file. This is awesome. It works great, and here we see the threads for the specific forum. Let's try another forum. Boom! Now we see some other threads. Let's go ahead and implement the forum details on top, instead of the hard-coded values that we copied from the mockup. I will switch out the static values with forum name and forum description. Let's check it out. Here we now see the details of the forum. If I navigate to the previous forum, give it a refresh, we see that the details update along with a thread list. That's awesome. One thing I noticed is that because we are not showing any sub-forums, our thread list sticks to the header. We can use the pushStop class to give it some space. Now this looks great. Let's remove the threads from our home page and show a list of forums instead. Let's take a look at our homepage mockup. These are forums grouped by category. Since we haven't worked on the categories yet, we can render all forums in a single group. I will copy the forum list element. Within the template of our forum list component, I will paste the HTML I copied from the mockup. I will collapse the divs using Command- to make it easier to grasp. Each element with class of forum listing displays one row with information related to one forum. So I will apply a v-for on this element, and I assume we will have a prop called forums that we can iterate on. Remember that we always have to apply a key when we are making an iteration in our template, and here the key will be the forum ID. Let's remove the other forum listing as we don't need it. Next, let's replace the dummy values with the real ones. Here we want to display forum's name, and here its description. Since it is too early to work with forum's last activity, I will empty the last thread div for now. We want the link to send the users to view the forum page. Thus, we can replace the A tag with a router link tag. The name of the route is forum, and it needs a parameter which is the ID of the forum. Be careful when typing a route's name. Route names are case sensitive, so if you write it with lowercase f, you will get an error. So make sure to have the first letter of the word forum uppercase. The next element is the thread count. We can get the count using the length property of the forum threads array. Good. Here it could be nice to use the word threads if there are multiple threads, but if there is only one, it would be nice to use the word thread instead. We can do that pretty fast directly in the template by using the ternary operator. So inside the braces, we will say if threads count is equal to 1, then return thread. Otherwise, return threads. Let's give it some space. Great! Next, the text in the heading is the name of the category. Since we will display all the forums here, I will replace it with the word forums. Once we define the forums prop, we are good to go. The forums are required and type of array. Let's see what we have done by using forum list inside page home. I will replace every reference of thread list with forum list. Here, instead of threads, we want to pass it the forums, so I will try to also replace all the references of threads with the word forums. I think that's a cool way to refactor this. Let's test in the browser. Here we get some errors. Type error cannot read property length of undefined. This happens because some forums don't have any threads, and thus forum threads is not an array and .length breaks. To fix that, we can check if forum threads property exists, and if it does, we will return its length. Otherwise, we can return 0. We could do this using the ternary operator as we did for the thread word. But ES 2020 introduces a super cool new feature that is called optional chaining. Optional chaining allows you to access deeply nested object properties without worrying if the property exists or not. If it exists, great. If not, undefined will be returned. To use the optional chaining, we use the question mark symbol on the optional object property. In this case, the threads. Let's see if that fixes it. And it does. That's great. We have this strange format here because we need the call full class on the root element of our component. Let me fix that quickly. Now it looks nice. Notice though that here we have just a word thread because optional chaining returns undefined and not 0. So when a forum has no threads, we see this thread. You can decide how you want to implement this. You might even want to leave it like that. I want to use the optional chaining so you folks have it in your code. So I will go ahead and apply a second ternary operator in the template that if length is defined, we will do that, and if it is undefined, I will display no threads. Let's see if that works. It does. That's awesome. But this makes the template look complex, so you might want to extract it to a method. I will do that. I will create a method and I will call it forum threads word. This method should accept a parameter forum. I will paste what we have in the template in here. Before I try to do the refactor myself, I will use WebStorm's refactor option that transforms ternary operator to if-else. This is a nice feature. I will just remove the optional chaining from inside the if block because here we know the forum has threads, as that's what we test in the if condition. Great! Let's use it in the template and check back in the browser. Excellent! We can now see all the forums and also all the errors have gone away. Notice how we correctly see the word thread or threads depending on the threads count. And when there are no threads, we display no threads. Good job! Since we used router links, we can navigate to a forum by clicking on its name. Pretty neat. Now our home page displays all the available forums. In the home page, we see all the forums. According to our mockup in the real application, the forums are grouped by categories. Let's take a look at the categories object. Each category has a name, a slug, an ID, and a list of the forum IDs that belong to this category. Also, each forum has a category ID attribute that tells us to which category it belongs. We can use the categories to tidy up the homepage. As we see in our mockup, we have to create a list, like the one we have right now, for each category. This sounds like we need a category list component. We will also need a route and a page component for the category page. Since we have seen how to implement this functionality, this is a great opportunity to build something on your own to practice what you have learned so far. I have put together some hints in lessons description. If you get stuck, try as hard as you can to solve the issues before you check the solution. You can Google as much as needed and maybe ask some questions on Slack. Okay, pause the video and come back to watch the solution when you are ready. I'm waiting. Hey, welcome back. I hope you managed to implement it on your own. I will start by creating the category list component under the components directory. The category list will need a prop that will be the array of categories to render. It should be required and an array. Once we get the categories, we will need to render a category element for each category. If you take a look at the mockup, you will notice that this element is the same as the forum list. The only difference is that we display the category name on top of the list. So, we want to render multiple forum lists, one for every category. We will need to create a method to find the forums for a given category. Let's say that we call this method getForumsForCategory and give it an argument of the active category. In the method, we should find the forums of the category from within source data and return them in an array. Let's import source data first. Then I will find the forums using filter. Each forum has a category ID attribute, which we can use to find the forums that belong to the active category. Good. Let's also pass the category name to the forum list so we can display it inside its title. Let's define this prop inside forum list. And use it in the template. We can give the prop a default value of forums to display this title if no category name is defined. I think we are good. Let's render the category list component inside page home. Again, I will replace the forum list occurrences with the category list. And then, instead of utilizing the forums, we're going to use the categories. That should be good. Let's see if it works in the browser. Awesome! We got it working on the first go. Here you can see the different categories. Here we have 3 categories, and in each one we have the forms organized there. If we click on a forum, we're able to navigate to it directly. So we can go in the page. Here we have 4 threads. Here we have the fishing. So our application starts looking really good now. It will also be nice to be able to navigate to a specific category in the browser under /category/ID. the same way we navigate to forums or threads. In the mockups, we see that the category page is nothing more than a forum list with the category information. And an H1 on top. To implement the category page, I will start by creating a new route right before the forum route. The path will be /category/id. I will give it a name of category. I will use the component category that will be a page component which I have not created yet. And last, I want to pass the params as props, so I will use props true. Let's create this page component. It will go under the pages directory, and it will have a name of category. As we do in most of the page components, we get the ID from the route, and then we find the resource, which in this case is a category. So I will define this prop. ID is always required. And type string. We also have to import the forum list component and source data here. We need the source data so we can find the category in the data. I will create a computed property, category, and find the category here. Source data, not source date. It starts becoming a bit frustrating having to import source data on every component that need to access the global state, so we will work on the state management in the next lessons. In the template, we can render an instance of the forum list component and pass it the forums and the title properties. We don't have the forums here, so for the moment I will copy this method from our other component. Category list. When we migrate to using a state management, we will not need to have these duplications in our code. If you wanted, you could also make a computed property for this that will return the forums for this specific category. That looks good. And we can also add an H1 on the top to display the category name. That should do. Let's import our component in the router file. I will navigate to a random category in the browser to see how it looks. /category/ and I will need to grab a category ID. We'll get the first one. And here we get not found. So maybe that's category and not categories. Yes, awesome. So this is the category that is called feedback and information. And because we have not passed the category name here, this displays the word forums. If we want to give it that title, we should say that the category name is that, but actually I think the word title is better. So we can make this prop title. We'll also update it here, because title makes more sense than category name. And then we can have the default forums. So this is better. And we'll just have to fix it in this page too. So we should update the prop in a category list component too. And now, if we check back in the browser, now it doesn't work. Why? Here we give it the title, it's the category name. Forum list accepts the title. Yeah, and here we don't use it. So if we update title in the template, yeah, that fixes it again. Perfect. So the last thing we have to do now is to link the category name to the category pages. So within the category list, what we can do is to pass an ID or a category ID to the forum list, and inside forum list we can decide if a category ID is set, then we will make a link here to send to that specific category. If no ID is set, then we don't need to create a link because this is just a list of no categories. So I will do that, and I will start by adding here our category ID. Now let's define this in forum list. Category ID will be optional, so required false, and if it is defined, the type should be string. Great. So now let's implement this feature here. First of all, I will create the router link to replace this A tag. So here we have router link. The 2 will be for the route category, like this, and the param will be ID that will come from the category ID property. Now we want to display this only if we have a category ID, so I will apply a vif here, and this will be based on the category ID. Otherwise, I will create a span with velse that will say forums. Or not forums, it should say title. Let's see if that works. Great, this is a link. If we click it, we can go to the category. This is awesome. We can try another one. Comedy, we can see this here and here. This works great. And to see if it also works without the category ID, I will remove this prop for a minute. I will refresh here. And now the links have gone away. Awesome, so let's revert that. With the category feature in place, we have implemented the core structure of our forum. We have the categories, the forums, the threads, and the posts. And we do have all these components and pages, and we're able to navigate everywhere.